Imagine a cool evening in late 18th century London. The fog rolls off the Thames, thick and smelling of low tide and coal smoke. You've just finished a long day of work, perhaps in a shipyard or a small shop. You have a few coins in your pocket, and the warm glow of a nearby tavern feels like the perfect end to a hard week. You step inside, share a laugh with a friend, and for a moment, life feels stable. But as you step back out into the night, the atmosphere shifts. The shadows near the dockside move. Before you can cry out, a heavy hand claps over your mouth, and a blunt object strikes the back of your head. When you regain consciousness, the world is no longer steady. The ground is pitching and rolling. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, wet hemp, and stale beer. You aren't in London anymore. You are in the hold of a Royal Navy warship. You have been, quote, zero. You are now a piece of property owned by the British Crown, and you might not see dry land again for a decade. This wasn't just a bad night. It was the beginning of a living nightmare known as life under the press gang. To understand why death was often viewed as a mercy compared to this life, we have to look past the romanticized version of the Age of Sail. We have to look at the reality of the British Royal Navy during its peak, a machine fueled by stolen men and maintained through psychological and physical breaking points. The system was called impressment. On paper, it was a legal right of the king to draft any seafaring man into service during a time of war. In reality, it was a state-sponsored kidnapping operation. The press gangs were groups of armed sailors led by an officer who roamed the ports, the streets, and even stopped merchant ships at sea. They didn't care if you had a family, a business, or a life. If you looked strong enough to pull a rope or haul a cannon, you were gone. The shock of the transition was the first blow. One day you were a free citizen. The next, you were a prisoner in a quote, _2_A. British man-o-war was a marvel of engineering, but for the men inside, it was a floating cage. Imagine a space no larger than a modern apartment shared by 500 to 800 men. The ceilings were barely 5 feet high, forcing most men to walk with a permanent hunch. There was no privacy, no quiet, no escape. The environment was a sensory assault. The ship groaned constantly, a symphony of creaking timber and straining rope that never stopped. Then there was the smell. In an age before modern hygiene, hundreds of men lived in a space with zero ventilation. The stench of sweat, bilge water, and the heads. The primitive toilets at the front of the ship was so thick it could make a newcomer vomit instantly. You slept in a hammock that was exactly 14 inches wide. You were packed in so tightly that when the ship rolled, you would bump into the man next to you. If he was sick, you were sick. If he had lice, you had lice. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the labor. A sailor's life was one of relentless, back-breaking toil. Every task was a test of endurance. You didn't just sail the ship, you fought the elements. When a storm hit, you were ordered aloft. This meant climbing a rope ladder 100 feet into the air while the ship leaned at 45-degree angles. You had to balance on a single foot rope, high above a freezing, churning ocean, while using both hands to haul in heavy, sodden canvas that felt like wet lead. One slip, one moment of weakness, and you were a memory. The sea didn't offer second chances, and the officers didn't stop the ship to look for you. When you weren't climbing the rigging, you were maintaining the ship. Holy stoning the deck meant kneeling on hard wood for hours, scrubbing with sand and stone until the boards were bone white. Your knees would bleed, your back would seize, and your hands would crack from the salt and cold. And if the worker didn't break you, the food would. The diet of a pressed sailor was a slow form of torture. The staple was hardtack, a biscuit made of flour and water that was baked so hard it could break a tooth if not soaked in liquid. These biscuits were almost always infested with weevils. Sailors would often tap the biscuits on the table to let the bugs crawl out before eating, or simply eat them in the dark so they wouldn't have to see what they were consuming. The meat was salt beef or pork, preserved in brine for years. It was often so tough and shriveled that sailors joked they could carve it into buttons or jewelry. The water was kept in wooden casks where it quickly turned green with algae and slimy with bacteria. To mask the taste, the Navy issued Quote 1, a mixture of rum and water. While it provided a brief moment of numbness, it was also a tool of control, keeping the men just sedated enough to prevent mutiny, but not so drunk they couldn't work. Then there was the constant shadow of disease. Scurvy was the silent executioner. It was a terrifying way to die. First, your energy vanished. Then your gums began to rot and your teeth fell out. Old wounds healed decades ago would mysteriously reopen. Your bones would become brittle, and your mind would begin to slip into a deep, dark depression. For a long time, no one knew the cause, and men watched their friends wither away into skeletons while still alive. Besides scurvy, there was typhus, the ship fever, carried by lice and yellow fever in the tropics. In many commissions, more men died from the conditions of the ship than from the cannons of the enemy. But perhaps the most soul-crushing part of life on a warship was the discipline. The Royal Navy was governed by the Articles of War, a set of rules that carried the death penalty for almost everything. However, the everyday tool of order was the cat-o'-nine tails. This was a whip with 9 knotted cords of heavy twine. Flogging was a public spectacle designed to destroy the spirit as much as the flesh. A man could be sentenced to 12 lashes for insolence, which could be as simple as not moving fast enough or looking an officer in the eye. The psychological weight of this was immense. You lived in a state of constant hypervigilance. You were surrounded by midshipmen, young, often arrogant officers who had total power over you. You were watched at every meal, every work shift, and every minute of your sleep. There was no time off. There were no weekends. You were a cog in a machine that valued the ship's efficiency over your humanity. The isolation was another layer of the hell. Because the Navy feared desertion, pressed men were often not allowed to go ashore for years. Even when the ship was in a home port like Portsmouth or Plymouth, the sailors were kept on board while the officers went to see their families. Women and traders were brought to the ship, but the men themselves remained prisoners on the water. Imagine being a few hundred yards from the shore of your own country, able to smell the grass and see the chimneys of houses, but knowing you are forbidden from stepping foot on the soil. Many men went 5, 7, or 10 years without touching dry land. Eventually, the ship would find what it was built for: battle. This was the peak of the nightmare. When the call to clear for action came, the ship was transformed. Hammocks were stowed, the partitions between cabins were knocked down, and the decks were sanded to prevent them from becoming slippery with moisture. The noise was the first thing that hit you. The roar of 30 or 40 massive iron guns firing at once was deafening, enough to make your ears bleed. The air became thick with the acrid, choking smoke of black powder, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of you. In a naval battle of this era, the primary danger wasn't just the iron balls, it was the wood. When a heavy shot hit the side of a wooden ship, it didn't just make a hole, it turned the interior into a storm of jagged, foot-long wooden splinters. These splinters acted like shrapnel, tearing through anything in their path. You stood at your gun, performing a rhythmic, exhausted dance of loading and firing, knowing that at any second, the world could explode into a hail of timber and smoke. If you were wounded, the cockpit awaited you. This was the lowest deck, below the waterline, where the surgeon worked by candlelight on a table often stained from previous occupants. In the heat of battle, there was no time for finesse. There was no real anesthesia beyond a leather strap to bite on, and perhaps a splash of rum. The surgeon's goal was speed, to stop the bleeding and move to the next man. For many, this was the final stop. Why was death better? Because death was an ending. The life of a pressed sailor was a cycle of suffering that felt infinite. If you survived the storm, you faced the hunger. If you survived the hunger, you faced the lash. If you survived the lash, you faced the fever. And if you survived all of that, you were still a prisoner, a man whose life had been stolen to serve a crown that viewed you as a replaceable part. The mental toll often led to a state called melancholy. Men would become catatonic, staring out at the sea for hours, or they would take the only exit available to them. Suicide was a common, though rarely officially recorded occurrence. A man might accidentally fall from the yardarm during a calm night, or simply slip over the side into the dark water, choosing the quick embrace of the ocean over another year of the wooden world. By the time the war ended and a ship was finally decommissioned, many pressed men were broken. They had lost their youth, their health, and their connection to the world they once knew. They were tossed back onto the docks of London or Bristol with a few coins and a body that could no longer work. They were ghosts of the men they used to be. The British Empire was built on the strength of its navy. It was the wooden walls that protected the island and conquered the globe. But those walls were held together by the blood and the stolen lives of men who never asked to be there. When we look at the majestic paintings of these ships with their white sails and golden carvings, we must remember the reality beneath the waterline. It was a world of darkness, filth, and systematic cruelty. It was a place where the horizon offered no hope, only more labor, and where, for the man in the hammock, the silence of the grave was often the only peace he could imagine. This is the story of the press gang. It is a reminder that history isn't just about kings and admirals. It's about the nameless men who were snatched from the streets and forced to row the gears of an empire until they broke. For them, the high seas weren't a path to adventure. They were a path to an early grave, and for many, that grave was the only thing they had left to look forward to.